talks won't happen again soon, the geopolitical reality behind the headlines. Let me take you back to June 16 of this year. That was the day the White House announced, with all the usual fanfare, that the United States and Russia had agreed to hold exploratory talks on strategic stability. The media ran with it: diplomatic breakthrough, thaw in relations, hope for de-escalation. Even the usual Russia hawks in Congress tempered their rhetoric, if only for a news cycle. But here's what no one in the press room bothered to: why now? And more importantly, why should we believe this will lead anywhere? I've spent the better part of 4 decades studying these patterns, first as a soldier, then as a strategist, and now as someone who watches the chessboard from the outside. And let me tell you, this latest round of diplomatic theater isn't the beginning of anything. It's the end of something. The end of the illusion that Washington and Moscow can still sit down at the table and negotiate in good faith. The end of the idea that either side still believes the other is acting in anything but cold, hard self-interest. And most dangerously, the end of the brief window where a miscalculation, accidental or deliberate, won't spiral into something far worse. So let's start with what they want you to believe. The official narrative is simple, clean, and, like most official narratives, designed to make you feel like the adults are in charge. The White House press secretary stood at that podium and laid it: Russia and the US have agreed in principle to discuss arms control, nuclear risk reduction, and even the possibility of a new framework to replace New START before it expires in 2026. The State Department followed up with a statement emphasizing the importance of dialogue in preventing miscalculation. Secretary Blinken, ever the diplomat, called it a positive step. The New York Times ran an editorial praising the administration for keeping the door open to diplomacy, while CNN framed it as a rare moment of cooperation between two adversaries. Even the Russians played along. Foreign Minister Lavrov called the talks necessary, though he added the usual caveat about Western hypocrisy. The data points seem to support this narrative. The US and Russia still hold the vast majority of the world's nuclear arsenal, nearly 12,000 warheads between them. New START, the last major arms control treaty, is set to expire in less than 2 years, and without it, there's no verification regime, no limits on deployments, no guardrails at all. The Pentagon's own 2023 Nuclear Posture Review warns that the risk of nuclear conflict is higher now than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And let's not forget the Ukraine is still burning, NATO is exiting, and Russia is openly threatening tactical nuclear use if its red lines are crossed. So on the surface, it makes sense. Two nuclear superpowers, staring down the barrel of a new arms race, decide to talk. What's the problem? But here's the problem with this: it assumes both sides still believe in the rules of the game. Let me tell you what's really happening. First, the timing. Why June 16th? Why not January, when the war in Ukraine was still in its early, fluid stages? Why not last year, when the US was first ramping up its military aid to Kyiv? The answer is because neither side was ready to talk then. The US was still riding high on the narrative of Ukrainian victory. Russia was digging in for a long war. And both were testing each other's resolve. But by June, something had shifted. The Ukrainian counteroffensive had stalled. Western unity was fraying, Hungary was blocking EU aid, Slovakia was wavering, even Germany was starting to whisper about negotiations. And in Moscow, Putin was consolidating power, purging dissent, and signaling that he was in this for the long haul. So what changed? The balance of power on the ground. Not in a way that favored either side decisively, but in a way that made both sides realize they couldn't win outright. The US couldn't force Russia out of Ukraine without risking direct conflict. Russia couldn't break Ukraine without escalating to a level that would trigger a NATO response. Stalemate. And in geopolitics, stalemate is the mother of diplomacy. But here's where it gets interesting. The talks weren't about Ukraine. Not really. Oh, sure, the White House will tell you they're about strategic stability. But let's be honest, strategic stability is code for nuclear weapons. And nuclear weapons are code for existential deterrence. The real issue isn't whether Russia keeps Crimea or Ukraine joins NATO. The real issue is whether either side still believes the other will hesitate to use the ultimate weapon if pushed too far. And the data doesn't support the idea that either side is in a mood to compromise. Take the US side first. The Biden administration has been no talks with Russia until Ukraine regains the initiative. That's a nice way of saying until Russia is losing. But Russia isn't losing. It's grinding forward, meter by meter, in a war of attrition that favors the side with deeper manpower reserves and a higher tolerance for pain. And let's not forget Russia's economy isn't collapsing. Sanctions hurt, sure, but they haven't crippled Moscow. In fact, Russia's GDP grew by 3.6% last year, while Europe stagnated. The ruble is stable. The military-industrial complex is running at full tilt. And most importantly, Putin's approval ratings are holding steady at around 80%. So if the US isn't winning on the battlefield, and Russia isn't collapsing under sanctions, why would either side come to the table? The answer is they're not. Not in any meaningful way. The June 16 announcement wasn't a breakthrough. It was a stall tactic. A way for both sides to buy time while they recalibrate their strategies. The US needed to show its European allies that it was still engaging with Russia, even as it poured more weapons into Ukraine. Russia needed to signal to China and the global South that it wasn't a pariah state, even as it doubled down on its war effort. And both sides needed to reassure their domestic audiences that they were still in control. But here's the neither side is actually interested in a deal. Let me explain why. To understand why talks won't happen again soon, you have to understand the broader geopolitical context. This isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the end of the unipolar moment, the idea that the US could dictate the rules of the international system forever. And it's about the rise of a multipolar world, where power is diffused among multiple centers: Washington, Moscow, Beijing, and maybe a few others. For decades, the US operated under the assumption that it could contain Russia and China simultaneously. That it could ex NATO to Russia's borders, encircle China with military bases, and still maintain global dominance. But that assumption was always flawed. It ignored the basic principles of great power spheres of influence matter. And it ignored the lessons of history. Let's take a step back. In 1962, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war because the US tried to put missiles in Turkey, and the Soviets responded by putting missiles in Cuba. Both sides recognized that there were certain lines they couldn't cross without risking annihilation. So they negotiated. They established rules. They created a framework for coexistence. But today? Those rules are gone. The US has withdrawn from the ABM Treaty, the INF Treaty, and Open Skies. It's exited NATO to include countries that were once part of the Warsaw Pact. It's placed missile defense systems in Romania and Poland, right on Russia's doorstep. And it's done all of this while lecturing Moscow about respecting sovereignty. Now, let me be, I'm not saying Russia's invasion of Ukraine was justified. It wasn't. But I am saying that from Moscow's perspective, the West has been pushing for decades, and Ukraine was the last straw. And if you think Putin is going to back down now, you haven't been paying attention. The same dynamic is playing out with China. The US talks about defending Taiwan, but from Beijing's perspective, Taiwan is an internal matter. The US talks about freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, but from China's perspective, those are its waters. And the US talks about democracy promotion, but from the global South's perspective, that's just code for regime change. So here's the US is trying to maintain a unipolar world in a multipolar era. And it's failing. Russia and China see this. They see a United States that's overstretched militarily, economically, politically. They see a Europe that's dependent on American security guarantees but increasingly divided. They see a global South that's tired of being lectured by the West. And they're acting accordingly. Russia is deepening its ties with China, Iran, and North Korea. It's selling oil to India at a discount. It's buying weapons from Pyongyang. It's positioning itself as the leader of a new anti-Western bloc. And China? It's building its own economic and military sphere of influence through the Belt and Road Initiative, through its dominance in rare earth minerals, through its growing naval presence in the Pacific. So when the US talks about strategic stability with Russia, what it's really saying: we want you to play by our rules, even as we change the game. And Russia's response: no. That's why these talks won't happen again soon. Because neither side believes the other is negotiating in good faith. The US wants Russia to withdraw from Ukraine, but it's not offering anything in return: no sanctions relief, no security guarantees, no off-ramps. Russia wants the US to recognize its sphere of influence, but the US isn't about to abandon its NATO commitments or its support for Ukraine. So what's the endgame? Escalation. Let's talk about the military and strategic implications, because this is where things get dangerous. Right now, the US and NATO are engaged in the largest military buildup in Europe since the Cold War. There are more American troops in Poland than there were in West Germany at the height of the Reagan era. The US is pre-positioning equipment, exiting bases, and conducting exercises right up to Russia's borders. And it's not just Europe, it's the Pacific, too. The US is ramping up its military presence in the South China Sea, conducting freedom of navigation operations, and strengthening its alliances with Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. But here's this isn't deterrence. It's provocation. Deterrence is about making the cost of aggression so high that the other side doesn't dare act. But provocation is about pushing the other side into a corner, where they feel they have no choice but to lash out. And right now, the US is doing a lot of provoking. Take Ukraine. The US has poured over $100 billion in military aid into the country. It's training Ukrainian troops, providing intelligence, and even allowing Kiev to strike targets inside Russia. But what's the endgame? Is it to force Russia to the negotiating table? Or is it to bleed Russia dry, regardless of the cost to Ukraine? I've been warning about this for years. The hawks in Washington, both in the administration and in Congress, believe that Russia is a paper tiger. They think that if we just send enough weapons, if we just impose enough sanctions, if we just keep the pressure on, Putin will collapse. But that's not how great powers work. Russia has survived worse. It survived Napoleon. It survived Hitler. It survived the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it will survive this. The real danger isn't that Russia will collapse. It's that Russia will escalate. And when I say escalate, I don't just mean more troops in Ukraine. I mean tactical nuclear weapons. I mean cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. I mean attacks on NATO supply lines. I mean a direct confrontation between US and Russian forces. Now, I'm not saying this is inevitable. But I am saying that the risk is higher than it's been in decades. And the reason is neither side has an off-ramp. The US can't back down without looking weak. Russia can't back down without losing face. And Ukraine? Ukraine is caught in the middle, fighting a war it can't win, but can't afford to lose. This is the lesson of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. The US goes in thinking it's a quick, easy victory. But it never is. And the longer the war drags on, the harder it is to extricate yourself. Now, let's talk about the domestic political dimension, because this is where things get really messy. The Biden administration isn't pursuing this policy in a vacuum. It's doing it because it has to. Because the political incentives in Washington are all aligned in one tough on Russia. Let's start with the Ukraine is a political winner. Polls show that a majority of Americans support military aid to Ukraine. The media frames it as a battle between democracy and autocracy. And the Republicans? They're not about to let Biden look weak on Russia, especially not in an election year. But here's the public support for Ukraine is a mile wide and an inch deep. Most Americans can't find Ukraine on a map. They don't know the difference between the Dnipro and the Donbass. And they sure as hell don't want to send their sons and daughters to die in a war with Russia. So the administration is walking a tightrope. It has to keep the aid flowing to keep the narrative alive. But it also has to avoid escalation, because the American people will not support a direct war with Russia. And that's where the domestic politics get really ugly. Take the 2024 election. Biden is running on a platform of restoring American leadership. That means being tough on Russia, tough on China, tough on Iran. But it also means avoiding a major war. So what does he do? He sends weapons to Ukraine, but he draws red lines: no NATO troops, no direct strikes on Russian soil, no nuclear escalation. But here's the red lines don't work if the other side doesn't believe you. Putin has been testing Biden's red lines for years. He's annexed Crimea. He's invaded Ukraine. He's threatened nuclear use. And what's Biden's response? Sanctions. More weapons. More rhetoric. But no direct military action. So Putin keeps pushing. And the more he pushes, the more Biden has to respond. And the more Biden responds, the more Putin escalates. This is the classic security dilemma. Both sides are acting rationally, but the result is irrational escalation without end. And let's not forget the role of key administration figures. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, is a smart guy, but he's also a true believer in American primacy. Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, is a career diplomat, but he's also a neoliberal interventionist. And Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense? He's a retired general who knows the costs of war, but he's also a bureaucrat who will follow orders. So what's the end result? A policy that's all sticks and no carrots. A strategy that assumes Russia will blink first. And a political environment that makes it impossible to back down. So where does this leave us? Let's talk about scenarios. Scenario 1, the frozen conflict. In this scenario, the war in Ukraine grinds to a stalemate. Neither side can achieve a decisive victory, but neither side is willing to negotiate. The front lines stabilize. Russia keeps Crimea and the Donbass. Ukraine gets security guarantees from the West, but not NATO membership. And the US and Russia enter a new Cold War, with proxy conflicts in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. This is the least bad outcome. But it's still bad. Because it means a permanent state of tension. It means a new arms race. It means a world where the risk of miscalculation is always present. Scenario 2, escalation to limited war. In this scenario, the war in Ukraine spills over into a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia. Maybe a Ukrainian strike on a Russian nuclear command center. Maybe a Russian cyber attack on a NATO member. Maybe a miscalculation that leads to a clash between US and Russian forces. This is the most likely outcome. Because the longer the war drags on, the higher the risk of escalation. And once that happens, it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle. Scenario 3, nuclear brinkmanship. In this scenario, Russia uses a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. Maybe to break a Ukrainian offensive. Maybe to send a message to the West. And the US responds with a conventional strike on Russian forces. This is the worst-case scenario. Because once nuclear weapons are used, even in a limited way, the taboo is broken. And once the taboo is broken, the risk of all-out nuclear war skyrockets. Now, I'm not saying any of these scenarios are inevitable. But I am saying that the longer this goes on, the higher the risk of something catastrophic. So what should we do instead? Let me be, I'm not advocating for surrender. I'm not saying we should abandon Ukraine or let Russia have its way. But I am saying that the current strategy is unsustainable. It's based on the flawed assumption that we can contain Russia and China simultaneously, while maintaining global dominance. And it's based on the even more flawed assumption that we can do this without risking a major war. So here's what we should. First, recognize reality. The unipolar moment is over. The US is no longer the sole superpower. We have to learn to coexist with Russia and China, not because we like them, but because the alternative is unthinkable. Second, prioritize diplomacy. Not the kind of diplomacy that's just a cover for military escalation, but real diplomacy where both sides have something to gain. That means offering Russia security guarantees in exchange for a withdrawal from Ukraine. Now, I know what the hawks in Washington will say, that's appeasement. That we can't reward aggression. But let me ask you, when was the last time the United States actually won a war of attrition? Korea ended in a stalemate. Vietnam was a disaster. Afghanistan collapsed the moment we left. Iraq is still a mess. And now we're repeating the same mistakes in Ukraine, except this time, the stakes are even higher because we're dealing with a nuclear-armed adversary that has no intention of backing down. Here's the uncomfortable: the Biden administration's strategy isn't just failing, it's accelerating the very outcomes it claims to prevent. Every time we send another $1 billion worth of weapons to Kyiv, every time we impose another round of sanctions that do more harm to Europe than to Russia, every time we dismiss the idea of negotiations as weakness, we're not containing Putin. We're giving him exactly what he wants: a prolonged war that bleeds Ukraine dry while draining Western resources and unity. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the broader shift in global power. The war has already exposed the limits of American influence. Look at the global South: India, Brazil, South Africa, even Saudi Arabia. They're not lining up behind Washington. They're hedging their bets, playing both sides, because they see the writing on the US can't dictate the terms of the 21st century the way it did in the 20th. And that's a problem, because if we can't even get our allies to follow our lead on something as existential as this war, what does that say about our ability to counter China in the Pacific? Let me explain why this matters. The Pentagon's 2022 National Defense Strategy identified China as the pacing threat and Russia as an acute threat. But here's the thing: we can't fight both at once. Not without risking everything. And yet, that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're arming Taiwan, exiting NATO, sanctioning Russia, and provoking China in the South China Sea, all while our defense industrial base is stretched thinner than a rubber band about to snap. The Army is struggling to recruit. The Navy is shrinking. The Air Force is flying planes older than the pilots who fly them. And yet, we're acting like we can afford to fight a two-front war against two nuclear powers. That's not strategy, that's delusion. Take the military implications. The war in Ukraine has already forced Russia to adapt in ways that should concern us. They've integrated private military commies like Wagner into their command structure. They've developed new tactics for electronic warfare and drone swarming. They've shown they can sustain operations despite sanctions. And most worrying, they've demonstrated a willingness to escalate when cornered. Remember the Kerch Strait incident in 2018? The Black Sea Fleet blockade in 2022? These weren't accidents. They were messages. And we're ignoring them at our peril. Now, I'm not saying Russia is 10 feet tall. Their military has taken staggering losses in Ukraine. Estimates suggest over 300,000 casualties, including tens of thousands of dead. Their economy is smaller than Italy's. Their demographics are a disaster. But none of that matters if they're willing to go to the brink, and we're not. And right now, all the incentives are pushing them toward the brink. The longer the war drags on, the more desperate Putin becomes. And desperate leaders do desperate things. So what's the alternative? First, we need to stop pretending that time is on our side. It's not. Every day this war continues, the risk of escalation grows. Second, we need to accept that Ukraine's 1991 borders are not coming back. Not without a war that could go nuclear. That doesn't mean we abandon Ukraine, it means we help them negotiate from a position of strength, not fantasy. And third, we need to recognize that our real strategic priority isn't Europe, it's Asia. China is the pacing threat, not Russia. And if we're serious about deterring Beijing, we can't afford to be bogged down in a forever war in Eastern Europe. Let me be, I'm not advocating for isolationism. I'm advocating for realism. The kind of realism that won the Cold War not by fighting endless proxy wars, but by managing competition without catastrophic escalation. The kind of realism that understands that the best way to protect American interests is to avoid wars we can't win. And right now, we're on a path to a war we can't win, against an adversary we can't afford to lose to. The question isn't whether we can defeat Russia. The question is whether we can afford the cost of trying. And the answer, I'm afraid, is no. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Ukraine or Russia, it's about us. The American political class has spent the last 3 years sleepwalking into a strategic cul-de-sac, and the bill is coming due. You see it in the polling, in the way the debate has been framed, in the sheer disconnect between what Washington is doing and what the American people actually want. Let me explain why this matters. First, there's the domestic political dimension. The Biden administration has tied itself into knots over Ukraine, and it's not hard to see why. They inherited a policy from the Trump era that was already drifting toward confrontation. Remember the 2019 impeachment over the Zelensky phone call? That was the moment when Ukraine became a domestic political football, and it's never really stopped being one. The problem is, the American people aren't playing along. Poll after poll shows that support for Ukraine is softening, especially among Republicans. A Pew Research survey from last fall found that only 31% of Republicans believe the U.S. is providing the right amount of aid or more to Ukraine, down from 44% in early 2022. Among independents, it's even worse. And yet, the administration keeps acting as if the public is fully behind this war, as if the only thing standing between us and victory is a few more $1 billion and a little more time. Here's the uncomfortable: the American people are tired of forever wars. They were tired of them in 2016, when Trump won on a platform of ending them. They were tired of them in 2020, when Biden promised to do the same. And they're especially tired of them now, when inflation is still eating away at their paychecks and the border is a disaster. You can't run a foreign policy that depends on endless subsidies for a war that most Americans don't see as vital to their interests. Not in a democracy. Not when the other side is actively campaigning against it. And that brings me to the 2024 election. This war is going to be a major issue in November, whether the establishment likes it or not. Trump has already made it clear that he wants to end the conflict quickly, and he's got a pub. The last time we had a president who promised to get us out of a quagmire, he won in a landslide. Obama's 2008 campaign was built on ending the Iraq War, and it worked. Now, I'm not saying Trump is Obama or that his approach is necessarily the right one, but I am saying that the political incentives are shifting. The longer this war drags on, the more it becomes a liability for Biden. And if the administration thinks they can just wait out the election and hope for a different outcome, they're fooling themselves. Let's talk about the scenarios. Right now, we're in what I'd call the muddling through phase. The administration is sending just enough aid to keep Ukraine in the fight, but not enough to actually win. They're hoping that Putin will blink, that the Russian economy will collapse, that anything will break their way. But that's not a strategy. That's wishful thinking. And it's dangerous, because it assumes that time is on our side. It's not. Scenario: the war grinds on through 2024, with Ukraine making incremental gains in some places and losing ground in others. The administration keeps funneling money and weapons, but the public grows increasingly skeptical. By the time the election rolls around, Ukraine is a major issue, and Trump wins on a platform of ending the war. He comes in, cuts a deal with Putin, and we're out. That's the best-case scenario for those who want this conflict to end. But it's not without risks. A sudden U.S. withdrawal could lead to a collapse of Ukrainian morale, a Russian offensive, and a humanitarian catastrophe. And it would send a message to our allies that we're not reliable partners. Scenario: the war escalates. Maybe Ukraine launches a major offensive in the spring, and it fails spectacularly. Maybe Russia decides to widen the war, targeting NATO supply lines or even striking inside Poland. Maybe Putin, facing domestic pressure, decides to use a tactical nuclear weapon to break the stalemate. Any of these could force the U.S. to make a do we double down, or do we back down? If we double down, we risk a direct conflict with Russia. If we back down, we risk looking weak. Neither is a good option. Scenario: the war freezes. Neither side can make significant gains, but neither side is willing to negotiate. We're left with a de facto partition of Ukraine, a frozen conflict that simmers for years, draining resources and attention from more pressing threats. This is the most likely outcome, and it's the one we should be preparing for. But it's also the one that the administration seems least interested in, because it requires admitting that Ukraine isn't getting its 1991 borders back. Now, let's talk about the establishment's response to all this. They've fallen back on a familiar: demonize the opposition, accuse them of being Putin's puppets, and double down on the status quo. You saw it with the whole isolationist smear. Anyone who questions the current policy is immediately branded as a traitor or a Russian stooge. It's the same tactic they used during the Iraq War, when anyone who opposed the invasion was called a Saddam sympathizer. And it's just as dishonest now as it was then. The reality is, there's a growing bipartisan consensus that the current approach isn't working. You see it in the House, where even some Democrats are starting to question the blank check approach to Ukraine. You see it in the Senate, where Rand Paul and others are pushing for more oversight. You see it in the states, where governors are starting to push back against federal overreach. This isn't about being pro-Russia or anti-Ukraine. It's about being pro-reality. And that's the problem. The establishment doesn't want reality. They want victory. They want to believe that if we just send a few more HIMARS, a few more Abrams tanks, a few more F-16s, that Ukraine will magically turn the tide. They want to believe that Putin is a paper tiger, that the Russian people will rise up and overthrow him, that the war will end with a Ukrainian flag flying over the Kremlin. But that's not how wars work. That's not how history works. Let me give you an example. In 1950, after North Korea invaded the South, the US and its allies pushed all the way to the Yalu River. We were on the verge of reunifying the peninsula under a democratic government. And then China intervened. Suddenly, we were fighting a much larger, much more determined adversary. We ended up back at the 38th parallel, right where we started. The war didn't end with a victory. It ended with a stalemate, a ceasefire, and a divided Korea that remains divided to this day. That's the most likely outcome in Ukraine. Not a Ukrainian victory, not a Russian collapse, but a frozen conflict that leaves both sides exhausted and neither side satisfied. And if that's the case, then the question we should be asking isn't how do we win, but how do we manage this without making things worse? Because here's we can't afford to lose sight of the bigger picture. China is watching. Iran is watching. North Korea is watching. They're all watching to see how we handle this, how we respond to a peer adversary that's willing to play hardball. If we come out of this looking weak, if we come out of this looking like we're willing to fight to the last Ukrainian but not willing to risk our own skin, then we're in trouble. Because the next war won't be in Eastern Europe. It'll be in the South China Sea. And if we're still bogged down in Ukraine when that happens, we won't be ready. So what's the way forward? First, we need to stop pretending that this war can be won on the battlefield. It can't. Not without a level of escalation that would risk a much larger conflict. Second, we need to start thinking seriously about diplomacy. That doesn't mean surrender. It means recognizing that negotiations are the only way this ends without catastrophic consequences. And third, we need to start preparing the American people for the reality that this war isn't going to end with a parade in Kyiv. It's going to end with a deal, and that deal is going to involve compromises that neither side will like. But here's the longer we wait, the worse those compromises will be. The more territory Ukraine loses, the weaker its negotiating position becomes. The more Russian soldiers die, the more Putin will demand to justify the cost. And the more we pour into this war, the less we'll have for the next one. I'll leave you with this. In 1969, Richard Nixon inherited a war in Vietnam that was going nowhere. The establishment told him to double down, to keep fighting until victory. Instead, he chose a different path. He negotiated, he withdrew, and he shifted America's focus to the real strategic, the Soviet Union. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't perfect. But it was the right call. And it's the kind of call we need to make now. Because the alternative isn't victory. It's a war that never ends, a drain on our resources, and a distraction from the real threats we face. And that's a price we can't afford to pay.